So first, thanks so much for the invitation. Really happy to be here. And in the email, it said 30 to 40 minutes, so it might be closer to 40 minutes. If it starts to get long, just kind of do that, and I'll stop it. So the title of the talk is Climate Without Crisis. And I didn't know that they were going to show our faces, and because Deborah can't be here, I thought I would just show you what she looks like. So there she is. And we've taught across various programs, including the undergraduate program, the MArch program, the B-Pro, and the Cinematic and Video Game Architecture program at the Bartlett to kind of just contextualize the kind of, breadth of different topics and mediums that we tend to address. So jumping into the talk, looking at the word climate over time and its frequency or the use of the word climate, we could see this pattern. The word crisis has experienced a kind of uptick in its frequency of use. And more specifically, the use of the word climate crisis as a sort of conjoined entity has garnered a lot of attention and more use since the 2000s. This brings about a question raised by Timothy Morton that says, could we defer the frantic knowing tone with which global warming is typically discussed in favor of wonder, acceptance, and comedy? And this particular quote for us resonates a lot because it frames the development and the attitude towards problem solving, and that attitude kind of being just as important as the solutions provided. So we'd like to elaborate on this notion of crisis through the example of the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, as described by Brian Groom in an article published in 2013 in the Financial Times. So in the 19th century, cities depended on horses for transporting people and goods. London, at the time the largest city in the world, had 11,000 cabs, and they were all horse-powered, and several thousand buses, each of which required 12 horses a day. New York at the time had a population of 100,000 horses that produced 2.5 million pounds of manure a day. So with that, you could imagine that the entire city would be covered in horse manure. So it was quoted that every street in London in the next 50 years would be buried under 9 feet of manure. What's interesting about these imaginaries is that they were built on a quote that never actually existed. And this was discovered in 2018 when Rose Wild, archive editor of the Times in London, began investigating the evolution of this story to find that the newspaper had actually misquoted itself. So it's true that the streets of London and so forth, they were all filled with horses and therefore, by default, horse manure. But it kind of moving from this general daily concern into the mode of a crisis is sort of this fictitious exaggeration. And the transformation from that is something that has been kind of used and propagated and referred back to during other forms of crisis talk. So these are just kind of different moments in which they referred back to this horse manure crisis. Again, something that's sort of fictitious, but used to prop up other kinds of debates and policies and so on. And so this is a moment when this fictional thing kind of becomes very real in our everyday life. And that kind of brings us to this first study. So these are two views of the Bangkok skyline on a clear day. And then these are the same two views in a more recent days where the haze and the pollution has made itself very clear by kind of blacking out or gray blanketing the entirety of the city. This presents a sort of synchronous and unbiased moment in the city because all inhabitants are sort of experiencing the same thing at the same time in real time. And though the media and the social conversations exchanged try to sort out different possibilities and so on, and that the news publications are producing all these kinds of information, here you can see this sort of conversations happening in the back end, as well as, let's say, simplified versions of interpreting what is air quality through these kinds of graphs and emojis. There's a question about, can we use this as an opportunity to reassemble the social sphere within the city? And we started to question if those people or that social sphere and the inhabitants and the constituents of that social sphere could be used in some way to actually produce a response in a way. So along these lines, we began exploring human hair, which culturally and historically has its various interpretations, value, and significance. Materially, it's something that we grow, stylize, cut, and we discard repeatedly. And although biodegradable, at the moment it's usually treated as a pile of trash. However, upon closer examination, hair is a complex matrix and it retains elements that bodies secrete, such as heavy metals. And with this, we began developing Follicle, which is sort of our longest ongoing project in some sense. And the idea was to use discarded human hair as an architectural material that is both sustainable and inherently possessing some degree of affection. In the construction of a pavilion, it was used as an experimental laboratory and a parliament in order to map the city's toxicity that we call a toxicartography. So a device at the center of the pavilion contained a questionnaire, a pair of scissors, mirrors, and everything necessary for you to anonymously submit a sample of your hair. These are just some images of that process taking place. And this is a sort of overview of that protocol. So you would snip your hair, package it correctly, answer the questionnaire, because certain information, like whether or not you're a smoker, could distort the data. And once all the samples were collected, they were sent to a lab to be analyzed and produce this sort of initial reading of the city through a toxicartography. And by the end of the event, we had somewhere upward of 200 samples that contributed to this entire map. So just to run through a little bit, this is the little device at the center, so to speak. These are details of the hairy pavilion. Some people find it repulsive, others find it nice and fuzzy. And this is where it was placed because it was a restaurant. So the restaurant owner was not happy, but it's fine. These are a few more details. And then this was the outcome of that research. So the toxicartography is actually live at the moment on the website, follicle.com. And the idea was that people could visit the website and understand the city through these different spikes produced by the inhabitants. And you could also isolate a certain chunk of the city, so this is a particular district, and you would understand if somebody was actually, like 2118 lives and works in the same district, while 3.33 lives in one district and works in another, right? So it's trying to make these relationships. Let's see here, just to play. Yeah, so this is a view of that interactive website, and that's kind of a chunk of Bangkok subdivided into its districts, and you can filter through elements or through the districts, which are those zip codes on the bottom. Right. Another interest we have is in decommissioning and adaptive reuse of abandoned materials. So in this case, this is the largest swing in Spain at the moment. And the small village, they asked for a swing to be made in place of those illegally installed zip lines structures. So our approach was rather straightforward. Let me see if I can get these all to play at the same time. It was basically just, let's dismantle the existing pieces, cut them down and reconfigure them, and aim for something that would result in the least amount of waste produced while having the most amount of impact for the city. So those are the 3 steps of decommissioning, reconfiguring, and then assembling. So as I mentioned, it's currently it's the largest wing in Spain, and it's part of this kind of wider initiative of an area that's experiencing an economic decline, both socially and economically, and a city that used to be based, or a village or a region that used to be based on mining coal, which has since stopped, kind of needs to turn to its next most valuable asset, which is its nature. So it's kind of this part of this ecotourism initiative that's happening over there. The structural elements were sort of left untreated so that the traces of its previous life could be read. And it sits atop this kind of mountainous view overlooking the village. So it's going to feel like we're switching gears because we kind of are, but it'll all connect again, so just bear with me. But in 2017, on April 1st, which is commonly known as April Fool's Day, Reddit hosted this collaborative experiment called Our Place, and it consisted of a digital square canvas measuring 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, with registered users being able to modify a single pixel. And the experiment ran for 72 hours, wherein the canvas dynamically visually updates and reflects the ideologies, alliances, and adversaries produced through this experiment. More interesting than the outcome, however, are the stories that are revealed when the canvas is studied evolutionarily over time. So this isn't our work. This is a guy named Greg Baum. It's just on YouTube. But it's interesting to see how the final canvas came to be, right? So this is that blue corner on the bottom right, getting very populated. You can see these kind of battles playing out, where this idea of preserving the penguin's eyes for some reason became very important. And then there's other little micro stories. So for example, Germany starts to grow, France starts to grow, Germany invades France, France retreats. So all this is very accurate. But then all of a sudden this rainbow kind of intersects and it forms the European Union. And it's like this little beautiful moment where something adversarial transitions into something cooperative. So that kind of brings about this little project we did, or this installation we did called the Gamer's Hut. And it was an opportunity for us to look into this idea of decommissioning participation and the production of like a small scale primitive hut or an inhabitable structure. And we reclaimed wooden pieces and cut them down to this commonly found dimension. And that created the 6 base modules for how this structure could grow. And the modules, they were non-invasively assembled using clamps, so that would allow them to kind of come back to their individual parts and then reassembled again, sort of repeatedly. It was exhibited at La Casa Encendida in Madrid for this exhibition on architecture on ecology. And essentially, it was a large model that contained a digital and a physical counterpart, using the 2 mediums as a ways to engage the public. So on one side, there was the scaled-down 3D printed pieces allowing visitors to assemble their own versions of the hut. And on the other side, there was a video game where people could click around and cycle through the different modules and grow their own versions. The variations made by the public were all saved within the game. And this is just kind of cycling through those variations. And this is the resulting archive of that experiment. Which is sort of a callback to Saul Lewitt's interest in the variations of an open cube. And it also kind of updates the story of what the primitive hut might want to be today and how we might refer to nature, and if our urban environments or our built environment is actually the kind of nature we should be looking at to harvest. So as opposed to that, this is Las Medulas, which is located in Deborah's home region of El Bierzo in Spain. And it's obviously a spectacular site, and Spain's official Twitter account touts it as the most important gold mine in the Roman Empire. So effectively, what we're looking at, this beautiful site, is a mine. It's the face of a mountain that's collapsed from excessive aqueducts and mining for gold in those aqueducts. Interestingly, the landscape is always portrayed from more or less the same angle, so that kind of talks about the role that the media has in kind of capturing this particular mine and the beauty of the mine. And we like this shot in particular because while it has Las Medulas as the thing that's really front and center, there are 2 less interesting, uglier mines from recent history. So it kind of talks also a little bit about the value system we have in certain mines and other ones. And if we look at the UNESCO website, we find that it's protected due to these things like outstanding universal value. It's a moment of, pre-something engineering and so forth, right? So there are all these things that qualify it to be something that wants to be protected. And in 2022, if we just look down this list, right, in Spain, just in that year, 40,397 assets were declared of cultural interest, 17,819 are immovable properties, so it just means they can't physically be relocated. 1,413 are in Castilla y León, which is where Las Medulas are, and 200 of them are archaeological zones. So we can't protect them all, right? It's just not feasible, not in terms of human power, not in terms of financials, etc. So in that same area, there's actually these prehistoric caves with rock art, and they've begun to fade away either through things like kind of weathering, which is something that nobody can really prevent, or in some cases vandalism, just sort of senseless acts of vandalism. So with that, sort of responding to this idea of how do you protect something that wants to be protected, but it can't be protected and so forth, this project buracos.xyz, which is also accessible, it looks at how we can preserve the caves, allowing virtual visits, at the same time withholding their physical locations to prevent further damage. So only a handful of people actually know where these caves are, and we had to go with this wild boar hunter who could actually take us to each one of the caves for these 3D scannings. But this kind of became a strategy for preventing further damage, but at the same time creating a sense of empathy that people could connect to and sort of appreciate that they have this thing, right? So this is sort of what ends up happening when you click on one of those caves. You can kind of enter it and explore it. If you click on one of those points, it brings about that kind of chunk of that particular area, and you can cycle through these different filters that with the naked eye you can't really see what the rock art is all about, but with these different filters that are specifically designed for rock art, it allows you to kind of see what each one of these images is about. So another feature is each person gets to vandalize if they want to, but digitally or virtually, so it doesn't really harm anything, right? And you get to trace over the images, which is just a fun, playful way to kind of, again, bridge that relationship that you have with these inanimate objects. What's been really nice for us was to see the kind of press and potential impact that it might have. So it really is working to kind of inform the locals of their own heritage, and to try to get them to kind of care about it a little bit more. And if anybody has read Le Petit Prince, there's this interesting moment in the book where the child he's drawn, the people can only see, he shows the adults the hat on the top, right? Well, they think it's a hat. So he's like, yeah, what do you think that is? And they say, oh, it's a hat. And he's like, no, it's a snake that's swallowed an elephant. But the adults can't quite grasp it because they've sort of lost that ability to have imagination. And for some of these rock art patterns, we don't really know what they mean or what they refer to, but this idea that you can kind of interpret them and potentially provide insight through this public engagement is something that we're also interested in. So thinking about preservation and moving up a scale, we kind of asked this broader question: if ancient Egyptians are known for their pyramids and Romans for their infrastructures, what will be the equivalent of contemporary civilization? And that kind of brings us to the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, where the two largest superpowers are kind of facing off in front of the Eiffel Tower. So on the one hand, you have Nazi Germany pavilion, or the Nazi German pavilion on the left, and then on the right-hand side, you have the Soviet pavilion. So originally, these 9 points of monumentality, they were published in 1943, defining a monument as something that is intended to outlive the period which originated them and constitute a heritage for future generations, forming a link between the past and the future. And the authors of these 9 points, they later critiqued the previous two pavilions as lacking that expression of man's highest cultural needs. At the same time, if we bring that to today, we can sort of interpret these as monuments in their own right, because these are the materials or the quarries used to produce those two pavilions, one granite and one marble. So as a fun, playful exercise, we revisited these 9 points of monumentality, and we've sort of stripped them down to their essentials. And again, it's kind of like this exercise that the kid was making in that drawing, sort of abstracting them a little bit and maybe providing new ways to enter into interpreting what a monument could mean. And one of them that we thought was relevant for this talk is modern and suspended positions can be the source of new effects. Such unexplored fields belong to our times, and man-made landscapes revealed to us by air view could be monumental architecture, more than strictly architecture and city planning. So it starts to talk about a larger scale of effects. So there are some precedent case studies that we find to be very relevant. So we'll just run through a couple of them. The first of these stories takes place on the Phi Phi Islands, found off the coast of southern Thailand, specifically Maya Bay, where the movie The Beach, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, was filmed, and which since has become a manufactured nature as a direct byproduct of the Hollywood industry. It's presented as an ideal and picturesque paradise, but it was actually achieved through 3 operations. I think a slide is missing, so I'll just tell you what those operations are. Hang on. There we go. Okay. So the first operation is the virtual closing off of the bay. So as you can see, there's obviously a gap in that one photo on the right where the person is recreating that iconic shot, whereas the one on the left, it's basically just one of the cliffs kind of cropped out and then placed over again and composited in. The second one is the sort of reshaping of the island itself, creating a more picturesque shoreline. And then the third is the addition of a coconut tree, which is not native to the island, but what's paradise without a coconut tree. So, since the film's release, it's seen more than 1.8 million foreign and domestic annual tourists, and that's 5,000 to 6,000 a day. And the consequences of that have radically changed the living conditions of humans, non-humans, and the biotope. Let's see, is there sound here? Is there sound? Is there a sound volume thingy? No sound? It's okay, it's just some tacky island vibe song playing in the background. But it's nice because it really captures what's become of that area. I think sound might be important at some point, if it's possible. Sorry, I think I turned up the podium mic, so now I'm screaming. Okay. I'm not going to touch anything else. All right. But in that particular case, we sort of defined it as a moment when fiction defines the real, right? So this interest or this production of the film has literally modified the future and the present of that region. In another but different instance, we see the kind of reverse effect, right? So we start to see the real creeping back into fiction. So this is a clip taken from Star Wars' film, The Last Jedi, on Luke Skywalker's home island, Ahch-To, and it's inhabited by a variety of alien species, like this guy over here. And it's actually a physical place located off the southern coast of Ireland called Skellig Michael. And in the film, the island is home to an indigenous avian species called porgs, which in reality are modeled after the puffin, which is a migratory bird who visits the island annually. The island is also classified as a special protection area, which essentially means nothing can be done that could disrupt the existence of the puffins or their migratory patterns. And it even maps the extent to which this law is applied. So it's not just to the islands themselves, but to this kind of surrounding boundary. And this matters because during filming, it made getting puffin-free shots kind of impossible. So the photoshopped image on the right is a playful exaggeration of what could have happened during filming, which would have ruptured the suspension of disbelief and break narrative continuity. It was ultimately decided that the best thing to do was to accept the presence of the puffins and create porgs. And porgs would then start to be CGI'd over each instance of a puffin. But even more interesting is that during development, they're probably like, well, porgs are really cute, why don't we have them everywhere? They started to inhabit areas where puffins would never exist anyways, like inside the Millennium Falcon. So this is one of those moments where, again, the real circumstances start to kind of play with the fictional ones. So this leads to a 2019 research trip that we did to Svalbard just before COVID hit. So we got really lucky with that. And it's the northernmost inhabited city or archipelago, and it sits deep within the Arctic Circle. Just for reference, the distance from London to Oslo is closer than Oslo to this area. An average winter will hit like minus 20 degrees Celsius, which is rather intense. And it becomes instantly clear when you arrive that this place is not fit for human life. Nevertheless, it is populated with humans. And it's subsidized actively by the Norwegian government in order to protect it from other geopolitical interests. So that's what kind of makes it quite interesting. So for example, the Nazis invaded it during World War II. They thought that if they could position a weather station up there, they would have a sort of forecast of how the weather would kind of come down to the rest of Europe, and that could give them a strategic position. So also, there's a city built by the Soviets called Pyramiden, which is the one on the left. And there's maybe, I think, 2 Russians still living there. So this geopolitical interest is what prompts the public and private interest to keep Svalbard inhabited by Norwegians and by Norway. But at the same time, there's an increase in warming temperatures that has caused a series of avalanches almost on an annual basis to occur. So what you see on the top right is the avalanche risk zone. And you can see that this town is kind of nestled in between two hills. And to try to reduce the damage caused by avalanches, they've put up, or they've erected these barriers all along the hillsides. In response to this, they've actively started demolishing homes and relocating the entirety of the town to this new coastal line in this kind of weird generic prefab architecture, but that's what it is. And strict environmental law, again, strikes again, kind of limits where humans can go in this area. So it's really starting to mess with the entirety, right? The relationship of climate, wanting to keep people there when there's no reason for them to be there, etc. Well, there is a reason, but right, it's complicated. So it pretty much sets this place up as a paradox. And this formed the basis for our speculative film called Re-Arctic, and it explores what decisions a self-governing Arctic would make if it were trained on a human value system. And that was screened at a couple of locations, which was fun. And I'm gonna see if the sound is working now, hopefully. Nope. Let me see here. Oh, it should play first. Not yet. Maybe it's me not connected to the thingy properly. It could be on my side. Yeah. But it says that I can also just do direct HDMI, maybe.
Mm-hmm. The problem is that the HDMI concept.
Play it on the computer.
The sound?
Yeah.
So this one?
Yesterday they were saying the output resolution should be set to this, so the video can play.
Is it okay if we do like a 5-minute break if it's a long video and then we see if we can get the technician to help us with this?
I don't mind, but maybe it's okay. Yeah, it's not the most important. I mean, it's okay. There's a link afterwards if you want to watch the film. I might just do that. That's okay. No, it's okay. I think we just continue.
There's this.
Direct into the jack, maybe. Yeah. That one. Yeah, right here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You would need to select this as a.
Okay, let's give that a shot. Here, right?
Yeah, so it's not. So it's headphones basically.
There's podium aux.
Yeah, and this is on.
Well, it's okay. I think I can just. No. Volume is up. I think it's alright. I'll just continue.
No, I'm sorry.
No, don't worry about it. It's all good. Okay. Well, anyways.
You're sure this is not microphone? This is.
Yeah, it's only. Yeah, that's okay. Sorry. Just to bring everybody back. So, so anyways, yeah, being there was obviously incredible, and seeing the extent at which it's trying to be occupied or controlled is also a site worth visiting. So I certainly recommend everybody to go and visit if they have a chance. But basically, in the storyline, there are three characters kind of discussing the current situation about how the Arctic has sort of declared its own autonomy from human presence, and that the reason you just watch the movie. There'll be the link afterwards in case you want to watch it. But it was a very fun experience. That was sort of very important for us because it created the kind of offshoots of these two little branches. One is on ecology and personhood, and the other is from Svalbard with love. So on ecology and personhood, it's basically an essay that we got to write, and it traces the history of the rights of nature as a legal framework, and then analyzes those two films that were previously mentioned, and then goes on to project forward what ended up becoming From Svalbard with Love. And this is the second development that was created for the Sol Biennale in 2021. And it links back to Longyearbyen specifically, and is materialized as a combination of a quadriptych displaying various scenes printed on a fabric, and the carpet itself is also a sort of map geolocating where everything is. And there were some physical models produced referring back to this decommissioning of the town. These are some plans, some different views, kind of showing how everything relates to each other. But a closer view of the quadriptych shows the combination of imagery and words and some of the scientific things, as well as some of the more playful things that we encountered when we were there. And that was quite nice, right? So one of them reads, "There ain't no trees in Svalbard," and for some reason we just love that very straightforward statement, but it obviously talks about, first of all, the scarcity in resources, and second of all, the impossibility for those resources to exist there. And then there's this other one that we quite like, which is there's one Tesla in town, and it gets its electricity the same way we all do, which is from the coal power plant, and isn't that ironic, right? So it kind of ties back to this thing of behaving a certain way or portraying a certain thing, but actually operating under a different logic. So this app was designed as a way to explore different possible outcomes of how Svalbard might evolve by tweaking a few parameters maybe, right? So we can just run through them, but in this particular instance, let's see. This one would have sound, but basically in this particular instance, the seed vault is completely abandoned. The initiative has been abandoned. And basically because it's already flooded once before, and again, linked to climatic reasons, and the original purpose or the original reason why they moved it or created it in Svalbard was because of its climatic stability, right? So we can see how climate change is starting to impact that. In another instance, like in the middle one, the seed vault is more active than ever. The world is carrying on the way that it looks like it's going at the moment. So more and more nations are kind of submitting their seeds to be stored in the event of natural catastrophe and other kinds of conflicts. So with that, it kind of transitions a little bit into some of our teaching work, which we kind of lump under this umbrella of cli-fi or climate fiction. And it really operates with this idea of preservation through adaptation. So the core thing being that how do we preserve something? What do we preserve? And how do we not petrify it, but kind of just adapt through the act of preservation, maybe admitting that some things will inherently get lost. And the methodology that we follow with that is this approach to context, decoding, recoding, gamification, and narrative. So contrary to maybe some of the other studios that might operate a little bit more tech-heavy first, we try to develop a research agenda with the students and then go through this process of decoding, so kind of cherry-picking out what is really necessary and then recodifying it. Again, this idea of adapting the thing that's trying to be preserved. And then gamification and narrative kind of go hand in hand. And it really stems into or branches into these two categories. One is climate migration, which has to do with people being forcefully relocated due to climate-related issues. And then the other one, autonomous ecologies. So investigating questions of what does it mean for nature to be autonomous? How would it govern itself and under what protocols and so on? There is a film here, but there's no audio, so we're not going to do the film. So I'm just going to skip that really quick. And I won't go into this too much, but it's just to mention that building onto this Monumental Wastelands, we got a grant to produce this 2-volume book called Monumental Wastelands. And it also has an accompanying application or a phone app with original augmented content by each of the authors. And it's also bilingual, English and Spanish, which is also obviously important. But it kind of brings together other people working on different ideas and themes related to this, one of which, the first volume is on autonomy and the second is on logistics. And then eventually we'll produce a third and so on. And lastly, we are currently guest editing a journal called Materia Arquitectura with the theme of press play, and that should be published in September. It can be purchased physically or it could just be accessed online for free. Jose Sanchez, who was in the house, he's going to be one of the contributing authors. And then this is the last slide, just kind of a compilation of the things we've written and then some links to the projects that you can access online or some of the videos. So thank you.
I think you brought up some terminology and concepts that are on resonance with the current political and practice-driven projects, like, for example, climate crisis, adaptation, weather-related hazards. And so the question that I have for you is, you presented some projects that are into imagining climate fictions or imagining inhabitants or ways of living when there's extreme situations. So we have these when we the very cold environment. So my question to you is, why do you think, like, we understand that humans are not optimal, so humans are always trying to do things that are not always in line to what optimal solutions are. In the practice that you have in the design studio, how will you bring this idea of gamification to solving these very big problems? I think that's one of the things in design studios happen all the time, is that we do have a concern, and in this case it's this climate crisis and this fictitious or this climate fiction. How will you use this gamification to try to address those very big questions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's certainly, let's say, I would say a relatively recent development that we're still in the process of learning a lot about, in a sense. So, for example, the follicle project was something developed in the studio, and although it didn't necessarily have a sort of gamification component, it had a participatory component. And we felt, and the kind of feedback that we got at that moment was that there is a will by the people to kind of get involved into something, right? And even though they didn't really have agency or the ability to influence anything really, they were still contributing towards a greater cause. And it was only really relevant, and we got really lucky in terms of timing, that the moment that they could contribute coincided with a moment of crisis, which was that huge amount of pollution that forced public schools to close, that forced people to actually stay indoors, and so on. So in that case, so that wasn't quite gamification, but it was definitely participation. Now, as we kind of take on this idea a little bit more rigorously, that first instance where you saw the Gamers Hut, that in a way it has gamified components, but it's not quite a game. There's nothing really at stake. There's nothing to really play for, but it was just an opportunity to kind of get to grips with the tools, let's say, right? And now currently the thing that we're trying to do is to push it forward a little bit more. So we've pitched an idea to a city, or to Deborah's home city, for a kind of promenade, right? But that the promenade could actually be cooperatively designed by the inhabitants with these add-ons, like ornaments, and each of these ornaments kind of works with a different non-human species. So there's a sort of like educational component associated to it, which we think matters, because otherwise it could sort of be like frivolous. And the way that education gets transmitted also kind of matters, because it shouldn't be, maybe depending on the scenario, overly didactic. It could be a sort of experiential kind of, I've gone through it and now I take with me this thing. I don't need to be explained everything directly, right? But so that's maybe some of the ways in which we're looking at using this notion of gamification into like real projects. Does that?
Hadin, I'm really fascinated by the way you use the game engine to, for me, is a way to process information, and then gamification is a way to kind of showing the information that is not usually visible for the human person. And then I really like the way you kind of use a non-human agency as a design component, as a constraint, and then you visualize representing information different way to engage with the design. Just add on top of the gamification. And so, does there anyone have any questions? Okay. And Hadin, if you can repeat the question for the online audience to
Paraphrase.
Paraphrase the question, sure.
Hello, thank you for your talk. It was very informative. I actually had a question regarding the project about the caves.
About the, sorry?
Oh, excuse me, sorry.
About the which one? The caves.
The caves,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
I really like the interactive component. We're talking about the concept of gamification and participatory involvement, and I really like the idea of being able to draw over the elements in a non-destructive way. When you were partaking in this study research, how did you find the general response of people after participating in the detailing of these events? Did it feel like the general perception was to be less destructive and more conservative towards these monuments, or did you feel like there would need to be extra steps to encourage people to understand the difference between the gamification aspect of the involvement and the actual perception if they were to visit these monuments in real life, to prevent them from translating this over into the real life counterpart?
Okay, yeah. So to the online audience, the question is about the Caves project and asking about how can you kind of ensure that virtual or digital vandalism doesn't translate into real physical vandalism. Is that right? Yes. Yeah. Nobody knows where the caves are, so that's a cheap answer, but that's the answer. Actually, it's a really interesting question, and I don't think I actually have the answer to that question. I know that there's probably been several studies done on how game behavior, like, is there a link between game behavior and how that translates into the physical thing, right? Like, GTA comes out, does everybody start, shooting and robbing and so on? Or I remember back in the 90s, Marilyn Manson, musician guy, was constantly being demonized by the more conservative groups because the thought was if they listen to this music, then they'll sort of be, Eminem, all this stuff, right? So I don't know that that was so much in our foreground because it wasn't so much, the form of interaction is not a vandalistic one, I guess, and maybe that's the key difference, if anything. So I use the word vandalizing because in a weird way, it's sort of, the story about, it's a story about like this guy who, he's on the spectrum and he has a rabbit and he loves the rabbit so much that he strangles it, right? Like it's maybe a little bit like that, where like, you might love the caves and you might want to show your affection to them in some weird way, but anything you really do, just being there is already problematic in its own right, So the best thing you could do is leave it alone, and if you want to engage with it, you can engage with it in this way. And the kind of interaction, again, is not very a vandalistic or aggressive one. So the lines in themselves don't carry with it a kind of aggressive gesturing, right? We could have made it so that you could throw a rock against the cave and see it chip off and so on, right? But it's meant to be much more of like a brushstrokey and meditative type of thing. So if you want to scribble, by all means go for it, but you're not going to get the satisfaction that you would if, right? So the interaction itself kind of embeds the attitude that you can kind of carry with it, and maybe that's where our role as a designer comes in a little bit, is to say, right, we can't control how you behave, but we can control what the platform allows you to behave or how it transmits or feeds back that behavior in a sense. So maybe that's, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It was a super nice spectrum of different projects and all with a different attitude towards how to address these like big questions, but like in a very local manner, on a very specific way, with like this idea of playing as well. Like I think this idea of like a playful attitude towards topics that are so big that like sometimes they feel too big to tackle for architects. I think my question is along the lines of modding, like game modding. Is that because there is this interesting idea that like a video game is set up by its creators according to specific rules, specific systems, specific kind of behaviors, attributes that you put to game objects and that are hard-coded into the real setup of the game engine, but then that still allow for like a creative, like one could say, adaptive reuse of that kind of system by the gaming community. So like you would have that like Half-Life or other games that like had seen like modding, and then through the modding different kind of games would come out, or different kind of engagements by, I don't know, like swapping the guns for shoes or whatever, and then having different kind of behaviors, and then that would change how you interact with that setup. And like I think this is something that like I was reminded when I looked at this swing in this amazing landscape, where you have a kind of like a physical adaptive reuse, but it's also kind of like a modding of a derelict or not functioning infrastructure to kind of allow for like a hack in that kind of setup. And I find that like a super nice outlook for architecture. And yet it's also kind of tricky because we don't have that kind of like big community as like a game community has. And it's very tricky to kind of like take up parts of the physical environment and hack them if one doesn't know the person who is in charge of that place, or who gives you the right to like change the structure and so on and so forth. So how do you kind of play productively between metaphors that come from video games and the physical space, and where do you see the kind of frictions that arise?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So to the online audience, the question is, or maybe the observation is that game space allows for things like mods and hacking. So in Counter-Strike, you might have an AK-47, and then you can swap that out with a shoe, I think you said. So, and so that's one aspect of the game space in general, is that you can modify things. And if you look at the physical things that were done, such as the swing, that's sort of a physical modding from the existing structures into chopping them up, literally hacking them, and combining them again. So where do frictions exist between this kind of game space in a virtual environment and the game space of the real environment? That's a great question. I think in the case of this, maybe the friction is legal. There's definitely a legal friction. So in that sense, what I mean by that is when repurposing materials for public use, there's no certification associated to that material. So a company that produces a material is liable for having tested it to go out into the world. And then you can purchase that material and use it because the liability is with them. And in the case of public things, that becomes trickier because something that's already been out in the world doesn't carry with it the liability back to the people who produced it. So maybe that's the biggest friction or challenge in terms of how you can navigate that, whereas in a virtual space, it wouldn't really matter where you get the items from, right? And then the second one, as you kind of pointed out, is the simple like scale, logistics, and the magnitude of the thing. So that's why, let's say with the project that we recently pitched, maybe next time I should just show it so it kind of makes it more tangible. But this word of ornamenting is kind of strategically used because it's harmless. You can ornament a tree, a Christmas tree, that's kind of the image that gets painted up. And there is a very reduced amount of risk. And that's a limitation, again, to this. You can mod the structure, but only superficially. But we try to make it performative in terms of, well, now there's a dog bowl, and that's great because dogs love water and need a dog bowl, right? Or there's an ashtray because so-and-so likes to smoke on that walk, you know? So it's still trying to mod it, maybe in the same way that replacing your AK-47 with a shoe is. It's kind of harmless, right? But yeah, maybe that's the biggest friction, I would say, is the scalability and legality.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hadin. So in your presentation, you showed the pixel art plays.
Yeah.
I found that kind of fascinating to show the ideas of how the game engine is a platform to kind of a space to negotiate between different participants in the same environment. And I guess the kind of ideas of negotiation or reconcile between different stakeholders and share with some of the work Jose has done in the past.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe we can later after Jose's presentation we can open up to discuss in that part of how do we reconcile between non-expert and expert in the design space. So,
Sounds good.
thank you.
Oh, sorry.
One more question.
I mean, it's half comment, half question as well. I mean, I love the kind of games of storytelling that you have, you know, with these, with the beach, with Star Wars, this and that, these kind of weird alien nations, you know, through which to look at the world, and immediately these kind of cliches of sustainability, the cliches of global warming, the cliches of crises and this and that, it unfolds in a completely different way. I'm just, so I'm thinking from the side of all the projects that you showed, they have a very particular aesthetic. So there's always this, there's a geographic, archaeological, infrastructural kind of fetish present there. And then I'm curious, where do you see architecture being present there? Because in my head, architecture is always this kind of a sudden appearance of an alien object that then kind of reorders things around it. You know, how do you kind of relate that to the infrastructural logic of a lot of the things that you're talking about? So I'm just curious about that. For the YouTube audience, architecture, infrastructure, what's the connection?
Architecture, infrastructure, what's the connection? Yeah, that's a yeah. I mean, so when you say architecture, you're kind of just referring to like this object, right? Like the kind of building, like or a pavilion or something.
I'm curious as to how you see it.
Yeah.
Where do you see these kind of games? Is there even a distinction? Is there something like that?
Yeah.
This fetish and the aesthetics.
Yeah, fetishes. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we personally care to make the distinction, and we've always generally just allowed ourselves to be interested in the things that we're interested in, and then just to go with it. So there's maybe a bit of an intuition that starts to drive a particular direction towards a project. So for example, the hair project, it resulted from a failed competition entry. I think we got like a mention or something, but it was for the City of Dreams Pavilion in New York. And obviously I think, yeah, hair in a public space, nobody wants it, but the brief was calling for a recycling pavilion, right? And we were just kind of getting frustrated with the number of recycling projects that involve PET, plastic bags, and this type of thing, right? So we really just wanted to go outside of the box with that. And it began really as a material interest. That material interest, the further we researched it, uncovered that it has this component for this micro scale element, the toxicity element, right? And just kind of kept going through that thread. So there's never been a distinction, really, and we've never really cared to identify that. I think specifically we're much more interested in questions of narrative and storytelling, and the how that research of the real kind of folds into the fiction and how that comes about. So whether it's architecture or not, it's not something we really concern ourselves with too much as a hard line, I think. Which is quite liberating. If you allow yourself to just do that, it just feels good. Cool. Thank you.